July 8th, 2024. At the Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital, it's business as usual. The largest pediatrics facility in Ukraine has been untouched by the war with Russia, mercifully left alone to provide treatment to youngsters in need. It shouldn't be a target. Those inside the hospital are innocent, with many not even comprehending the true scale of the conflict that surrounds them. The hospital has been safe until today. In a desperate attempt to damage Kyiv, Russia launched a wave of missile strikes against the city. Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital is one of the targets. The explosions caused major damage to the facility and killed 2 people. That attack was part of a larger-scale strike on the city, in which 36 people were killed and a further 140 injured. Speaking about the attack, a doctor named Lesia Lesticia told the BBC about the moment the missiles struck. She describes the scenes as being like a film, noting that there was a big light followed by a truly awful sound. The aftermath, she said, revealed that one part of the hospital was destroyed and there was a fire in another. It's really very damaged, maybe 60 to 70% of the hospital. Russia has crossed a line. Ukraine has to respond. And respond it does. In this video, we'll go into detail on the devastating drone strikes Ukraine organized in the wake of Russia's attack on the children's hospital. But first, we'll explain the strike in more detail, including what missiles Russia used, what conducting such a strike says about Russia, and the claims made by Putin in the wake of the attack. We start with more information about the strike. Pictures that emerged from the scene showed sheer devastation. Children who just moments before had been receiving treatment inside the facility are now outside, pulling along their IV drips as they wait to be fully evacuated. Depending on your perspective, there is at least a small moment of good fortune. Though 2 people have died in the attack, both are confirmed to be adults. It appears that Russia has failed to kill any children in the strike, though that wasn't likely by choice. Kyiv's mayor Vitaly Klitschko revealed that information in the aftermath of the attack. However, he also served a chilling reminder that much of the hospital had been reduced to rubble. There was no telling how many, if any, people were trapped underneath all of that debris. More details emerged in the immediate aftermath of the missile strike. Ukrainian television notes that around 20 children were in the hospital at the time of the strike, most receiving treatment for cancer or being prepared for organ transplants. Klitschko also levied an accusation against Russia, claiming that this latest attack showcases a country that's attempting genocide of the population of Ukraine. He sent a message to the world saying that they can now see how Russian missiles and drones are killing Ukrainians in peaceful cities. As the day goes on, more details emerge, revealing the strike on the children's hospital to be part of a wider range of strikes, all involving Russian missiles. Klitschko notes that the children's hospital isn't the only Ukrainian medical facility that's been damaged. A separate maternity hospital, located in the Dniprovsky region of Ukraine, was also partially destroyed by falling debris caused by the bombs. There have been fatalities here too. 7 people are dead. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky later took to social media to explain that more than 40 missiles of different types had been launched at major Ukrainian cities. Kyiv was the main target, though Sloviansk, Dnipro, Kramatorsk, and Kryvyi Rih were also targeted. He joined Klitschko in saying that the eyes of the world must now be on Russia, calling again for a strong Western response to the blow that Russia has once again delivered on our population, on our land, on our children. On July 11th, 3 days after the strike, more details emerged about the damage caused. Human Rights Watch reports that the casualties caused by the Russian missile wave have increased as rescuers spend time sifting through the rubble. Now the tally stands at around 190 civilians injured, with 42 people having been killed. 5 of those people are children. More information is also made available about the scale of the damage caused to Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital. Speaking to the UN Security Council, the hospital director says that Russia's strike destroyed the hospital's traumatology and toxicology departments. It also caused severe damage to its oncology and surgical wings, as well as to its intensive care department. The director also reveals that several hundred children were in the hospital when air raid sirens went off at 9:52 a.m. Fortunately, most were evacuated in the hour between the sirens going off and the missiles landing, though several patients and staff were still in the hospital when the missiles hit. These patients included 3 who were undergoing heart surgery. As disturbing as all of these details are, Human Rights Watch reveals that this strike is far from the first that has targeted Ukrainian medical facilities. It says that at least 1,736 Ukrainian medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed in missile strikes and bombing runs, with Russia having set out its stall in terms of being willing to target these locations early in the war. For instance, March 9, 2022 saw a Russian bomb landing in the courtyard of Hospital No. 3 in Mariupol, destroying the facility's maternity and pediatric units, killing several staff members and patients. Details also begin to emerge about the missiles used in the strike. On July 10th, CNN reported that a UN assessment concluded that the missile used to strike the hospital was likely a Russian-made Kh-101 cruise missile. That conclusion aligns with that reached by several weapons experts in the immediate wake of the attack, CNN says, with analysis of both video footage of the strike and fragments left in its wake supporting the conclusion. One of those experts is Justin Bronk, who is a senior research fellow working for London's Royal United Services Institute. Speaking to CNN, he says that the footage showing the missile landing is exactly correct for the Kh-101, with the right dive angle, under power, and not tumbling or falling like a spent air defense missile might. Bronk mentions a spent air defense missile because the Russian propaganda machine went into overdrive following the attack. Social media was full of claims, both from pro-Russian accounts and those in favor of Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine, that the weapon that struck the hospital wasn't a Russian missile at all. Instead, it was the spent shell of a Ukrainian aerial defense weapon, which had landed on the hospital as Kyiv desperately tried to take out Russian missiles that were en route to other targets. The evidence doesn't seem to support that claim. Instead, the UN report and analysis from other weapons experts all point to the Kh-101. According to Missile Threat, the Kh-101 is an air-launched cruise missile that's equipped with a conventional explosive warhead. Developed by Russia, it's intended as a stealth missile, with its main characteristic being its ability to fly lower than a typical missile, allowing it to avoid radar detection systems and stay out of the range of many air defense units. There is also a variant of the Kh-101 named the Kh-102, which has been adapted to allow it to carry a 250 kiloton nuclear warhead. Returning to the Kh-101, it's around 24.4 feet long and carries a 992-pound payload, with Russia also having the option of equipping it with high explosive, submunition, or fragmentation payloads. It's also a rangy weapon. The missile can fly up to 1,739 miles en route to its target. Russia claims it can fly for even longer, with unconfirmed reports out of the Russian Ministry of Defense stating it had a range of 2,796 miles. Either way, it's a missile that Russia could have launched from behind the front lines, knowing that it can travel far enough to hit almost any target in Ukraine. Several Russian planes are capable of carrying the Kh-101, including the Su-32 strategic bomber, the Tu-60, and the Tu-95 MS-16. The missile is also equipped with an electro-optical correction system, allowing it to adjust course in the middle of its flight, and an onboard computer that allows the missile to conduct photographic analysis of terrain to aid these course corrections. Missile Threat says that the Kh-101 also uses an infrared imaging seeker as it reaches its terminal stage when it's nearing its target, and is guided by the GLONASS satellite navigation system. It's the ideal missile for such a targeted strike. The Kh-101 can be fired from range, meaning Russia doesn't have to risk flying its planes over Kyiv and potentially put them under fire from aerial defenses, and it's accurate enough to hit its target. Nevertheless, Russia is still claiming that it didn't attack Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital. On July 9th, Dmitry Peskov, a Kremlin spokesperson, repeated Russia's denials, telling journalists that they should be guided by information that comes out of Russia's Ministry of Defense rather than reports they're reading elsewhere. That information, he claims, absolutely excludes that there were attacks on civilian targets, and which states that we are talking about a failing anti-missile system. Again, the same denial. Ignoring for a moment that Ukraine even having to use an anti-missile system, failing or otherwise, would suggest that Russia had indeed launched missiles at civilian targets in Kyiv, the photographic evidence doesn't support Peskov's claims. The Kremlin is trying to cover its tracks, and it's doing so because the July 8th missile strike against the Children's Hospital reveals something damaging to Russia. Its military is eroding. That's according to a July 16th article published by The Conversation. It repeats the claim that this attack is far from the first instance in which Russia has targeted a hospital. Furthermore, it sheds light on the meaning behind one of Peskov's claims in the wake of the strike. The Kremlin spokesperson says that Russia only targets facilities it believes are being used for military purposes, a claim that the country has used to justify targeting hospitals in the past. There's just one problem. Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital is so far removed from the front lines of Russia's special military operation that it would be practically impossible to claim that it serves a military purpose. Of course, it's also a children's hospital, which makes it even more improbable that Russia could justify the attack with the same excuse. Instead, The Conversation argues Russia is engaging in an intentional campaign of disinformation, hence the claims of failing Ukrainian anti-air defenses, because it's trying to hide domestic issues. Those issues extend to its military, which it claims is being affected by the sanctions imposed upon it by the West. Though Russia has managed to protect itself from becoming an isolated nation as a result of these sanctions thanks to cutting deals with countries like Iran and North Korea, it's still facing problems. Chief among these is that the sanctions have prevented vital military electronics from reaching the country. Even as it ramps up production of artillery and missiles, Russia finds itself having to increasingly rely on civilian-made components, which degrade its weapons capabilities and make them less accurate than they would otherwise be. In other words, it's possible that Russia didn't actually target the Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital. Instead, the components being used in its Kh-101 missiles, which are among the most accurate in Russia's arsenal, may not be fit for purpose. That could lead to the missile flying off course, which could explain why it struck a children's hospital rather than whatever target Russia intended. Of course, the Kremlin would never admit such a fault, so it's trying to place the blame on failing Ukrainian equipment, even as the evidence mounts that the missile that struck Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital was indeed a Kh-101. So that leaves two possible situations. Either Russia is growing so desperate in its attempts to defeat Ukraine that it's willing to target the most innocent civilians to wreak terror, or its weapons are becoming less effective because of sanctions forcing the use of civilian components, meaning it's failing to strike its intended targets. Those failures can result in situations like the one seen in Kyiv on July 8th, which the Russian propaganda machine is being forced to spin because Moscow can't admit that its missiles might be faulty. Whatever the case may be, the fact remains that Russian missiles hit a children's hospital in Ukraine, and Ukraine had to retaliate. That brings us to the drone strikes Ukraine has launched in the wake of Russia's attack. President Zelensky made it clear that Ukraine would retaliate for the attacks in their immediate aftermath. Speaking at a press conference on July 8th, he told reporters that, "We will retaliate against these people. We will deliver a powerful response from our side to Russia for sure. The question to our partners is, can they respond?" These claims are notable for two reasons. First, they once again show Zelensky calling on Ukraine's Western supporters to do more in the fight against Russia. Though he didn't outright say, the implication is that he believes that Ukraine's allies should be more directly involved in the fighting. The latest rounds of aid, though generous, are not enough. The West needs to recognize that a Russia that's willing to target a children's hospital is a Russia that poses a threat to all of Europe. Zelensky is challenging the West to respond with force equal to that Russia is using against Ukraine. Second, Zelensky says, "We will deliver a powerful response from our side to Russia." In other words, Ukraine won't limit its response to Russia's strike to attacking Russia within its own borders. It's going to attack Russia in Russia. That's precisely what it did with its most recent drone strikes. On July 9th, Reuters reported that a fleet of Ukrainian drones attacked a pair of power substations and an oil depot located in several Russian regions that border Ukraine. Russian officials claim that the attacks featured dozens of drones and resulted in the power stations and oil depot catching fire, along with the death of one person. In a statement published on the Telegram social media platform, Russia's Ministry of Defense went into more detail. It claimed that the country's air defense systems managed to shoot 38 of Ukraine's drones out of the sky, with 21 of those drones being destroyed over the skies of Rostov. The oblast lies to Ukraine's southeast, near the disputed Crimea region. It's about 62 miles from the eastern border Ukraine shares with Russia, with The Independent noting that Rostov is also the largest city in Russia's southern region. The attacks didn't end there, as Russia also reported shooting down 7 drones over Kursk, another Russian city near the border with Ukraine. Interestingly, we see potentially more examples of Russian misinformation here. While Ukraine will naturally claim that the fires at the power stations and oil depots were caused by the drone strikes, Russia is trying to paint a different picture. In another Telegram post, Rostov regional governor, Andrei Bocharov, suggests that the drone attacks themselves were unsuccessful, with the depot and power stations being set ablaze as a result of debris falling from the drones after they were destroyed by anti-air defenses. That seems unlikely. Upstream provided more details about the oil depot fire, noting that it occurred in Kalash-on-Don, which sits within Russia's Volgograd region. The depot is operated by a subsidiary of Lukoil, Russia's second-largest energy company after Gazprom, and the strike involved dozens of drones. However, this time the account is slightly different. Where some local representatives claim that it was drone debris that caused the fire, Upstream reports that other regional authorities claim that at least 5 of Ukraine's drones scored direct hits on the oil depot. Whatever the case may be, Ukraine had a defined purpose in choosing this depot outside of getting revenge for the attack on Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital. The oil depot lies close to a canal that links the Don and Volga rivers, both of which are key Russian transportation routes. The depot has also grown in strategic importance to Russia since the outbreak of the Ukraine war because it's able to keep small river tankers stocked with oil that can be delivered to Russian troops in Crimea and those stationed along the shore of the Sea of Azov. By hitting that depot, Ukraine struck a key part of Russia's logistical network. Russia was still struggling to get the fire under control in the immediate aftermath of the attack, with the blaze reportedly spreading to a nearby bakery. The drone strikes wouldn't end there. On July 11th, Reuters reported on Russian claims that a Ukrainian drone strike on a courtyard in the Belgorod region had resulted in 5 children being injured. Writing on Telegram, Belgorod's regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, said, "In the town of Shebekino, an explosive device was dropped deliberately from a drone in the courtyard of a multi-story apartment building. 5 children who were in the playground received various injuries, 2 of them in serious condition, and were taken to the regional children's hospital." Is that a potential misstep by Ukraine? Attacking a civilian courtyard with drones that injured children would take away the country's moral high ground. It's notable that Ukraine hasn't issued a denial of the attack, suggesting that it was responsible. Regardless, Belgorod has been a clear target of Ukraine, with a combination of this drone attack and shelling from Ukrainian forces leading to the July 17th decision to institute a lockdown of the region. Belgorod's governor says that public access to 14 of the region's villages will be restricted due to them being in the path of constant Ukrainian artillery bombardments. Checkpoints will be set up on access roads and representatives of law enforcement will be on duty there, claimed the governor, before pointing out that access to public transport, including taxis, will be banned from July 23rd. Gladkov also announced that Russia's military will start guarding residents' homes, because they show that Russia's attempts to take the Kharkiv region of Ukraine are faltering. Putin's goal in his assault on this region was to create a buffer zone between Belgorod and Ukraine, with Kharkiv itself becoming a new front line that would take Ukraine's focus away from Russian territory. That isn't what happened. Instead, Russian forces have been pushed back to the point where Ukraine can now conduct artillery and drone strikes on another key piece of Russian border territory. But what do you think? Is there any credence to Russia's claims that it was a Ukrainian anti-air missile that actually destroyed Ohmatdyt Children's Hospital? What do you think about Russia's claims that Ukraine's retaliatory drone strikes have also injured children? And where do you think that both Russia and Ukraine go next in the war, now that Ukraine appears to be making headway in attacks near the beleaguered Kharkiv region? Share your opinions in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Here's a question. If you're a small country and you're invaded by your much larger and more powerful neighbor with at least 3 times as many troops, significant numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and aircraft, and a national economy that was about 10 times larger before the invasion, how could you defeat it on the battlefield? There's only one way: survive on your wits and make the invaders pay in ways they didn't expect or prepare for. The Ukrainians figured out many different ways to do this, often taking advantage of Russian incompetence and corruption. The most important way, though, was through Ukraine's use of drones. In the war's opening phase, larger drones like Turkey's Bayraktar TB2 played an important role in destroying Russian convoys and even sinking the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva. Russia was unprepared for this type of conflict, but Ukraine then surprised their enemies again, this time with smaller first-person view or FPV drones. What are these, and why have they proven so effective on the modern battlefield? Let's take a look at how Ukrainian drone pilots have used these to devastating effect on the Russian forces and how vital they are for Ukraine's war effort as a whole. On June 18, 2024, Russia lost over 100 vehicles. Ukraine lost about 30. It was nearly a record in both the number of Russian vehicles lost and the ratio of Russian vehicles lost compared to Ukrainian vehicles. But Ukraine didn't need to expend a lot of precious artillery shells or expensive Javelin missiles to do this. Most of the time, FPV drones were responsible for the destruction of Russian tanks. FPV drones have onboard cameras that transmit their visual feeds as a live stream directly to the operator's preferred device. This can be a panel, tablet, or smartphone, but in Ukraine, goggles or headsets are the most popular method because they let the operator directly see what the drone sees. One of Ukraine's ace drone operators, codenamed Darwin, said in a documentary entitled Darwin's War, inside the secret bunker of Ukraine's ace FPV drone pilot, that he feels like a bird when he's on a mission, a bird that explodes in the end. These drones are cheap, typically ranging from a few $100s to perhaps slightly less than $2,000 on Amazon. The headsets and goggles will cost extra, typically ranging from a mere $40 to something more sophisticated at $800. The drones used on June 18th were likely in the $500 price range, and yet these weapons have destroyed Russian vehicles that cost between thousands, hundreds of thousands, or in the case of the tanks that have fallen prey to them, millions of dollars. One can see why these FPV drones are ideal for a country like Ukraine, which must contend with a wealthier, more powerful neighbor by traditional military reckoning. Fortunately for Ukraine's armed forces, drones became capable enough to act as an equalizer at just the time Russia decided to invade their country. Unsurprisingly, the Ukrainians have invested heavily in this arm, producing and deploying about 100,000 of them a month, twice as many as the estimated 50,000 a month at the start of the year. it's currently on track to exceed its goal of producing 1 million by the end of the year. FPV drones act as excellent surveillance tools. They can monitor Russian troop movements and relay coordinates to artillery. However, they have had their biggest impact as weapons. Explosives are attached to these FPV drones. These can range from smaller anti-personnel weapons to larger shells. Early in the war, Ukraine attached 3D-printed fins to the millions of Soviet anti-tank grenades it had in storage. The drones then released these grenades onto enemy armored assets or simply crashed into them. It was an indication of how important FPV drones would become throughout the war. More recently, bigger explosives have been fitted to these weapons. Ukrainian drone pilots have taken to calling the largest shell that can be attached to an FPV drone the Avada Kedavra round, after the so-called killing curse in the Harry Potter series. The pilots gave it this name because it has a better chance of destroying enemy tanks. Once at their targets, the pilots then either release the explosives or, more often, crash the drones into them. Experienced operators like Darwin are so good that they can target the most vulnerable spots of their target to maximize their impact. For example, when hunting a vehicle, a good drone pilot can attack the driver or engine. The pilots are so good that they can fly their drones into pipes or through apartments where Russian troops are taking cover. Once inside, the drone can detonate in a specific room. FPV drone tactics have evolved quickly in Ukraine. According to Alexander Kamyshin, Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Ukrainian troops began using these kamikaze drones against large and obvious targets like Russian armored vehicles. As their skills improved, they began to locate and target command posts, which, though hidden, were often kept close to the front lines in the war's first year, because senior officers in the Russian army do not trust their juniors and NCOs to take the initiative. Now, Ukraine's drone pilots can hunt down small groups of soldiers or even target individual soldiers, just as a sniper would. Kamyshin claims that the FPV drone has become Ukraine's main battle weapon. A first-hand look into an FPV drone mission gives a glimpse of how terrifying these weapons can be to the enemy, unfortunate enough to be on the other side of them. In one instance, Darwin flies his drone around, looking for a Russian soldier who is trying to hide. The drone hovers ominously until Darwin finds his enemy and crashes into him. Even more ominously, good pilots can bring their drones in slowly so that their targets won't hear them and run away. Other drones, like the so-called Vampire, are large enough to drop multiple explosives or even lay landmines or deliver ammunition to isolated Ukrainian positions. The Vampire drone is feared enough among Russian soldiers that they've taken to calling it the Baba Yaga, claiming that it has huge claws capable of picking up their wounded and flying them to laboratories. In 2023, Russia began to realize the importance of these drones as casualties and burned-out vehicles piled up. Steadily, the Russians began to ramp up their FPV drone production. By December, Ukrainian sources estimated that Russia was producing 300,000 of them per month, 6 times more than their own side. Some Ukrainian commanders said at the time that the Russians had 7 FPV drones in the air for every 1 Ukrainian. However, Ukraine has since regained the advantage. Russian FPV drone activity peaked in January 2024 and has since declined, with Ukraine's lead growing as the year matured. Soviet-style centralized production of drones may be one of the reasons for the decline in Russian activity. Russia has only one official long-range drone, the Iranian Shahid, which is built at one factory in Alabuga in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan. There is also only one tactical drone, the Lancet. In contrast, Ukraine has invested heavily in a variety of companies that build drones throughout the country. The Ukrainians are currently operating at least 15 types of long-range drone and several tactical drones. In his interview on the aforementioned documentary, Alexander Kamyshin mentioned that as the minister in charge of Ukraine's war production, FPV drones were his top priority. The numbers bear this out. Despite the vast increase in production, though, he jokingly responded that there were never enough drones available. To ensure that it reaches its goals, Ukraine has enlisted vast swathes of its civilian population in the drone effort. Production is so decentralized that local artists make some of the drones by hand, get orders and send them to the front. Each unit also has a specialized workshop to modify the drones according to its needs. The drones are often crowd-funded and donated by charities. FPV drones are a popular item for Ukraine's official crowdfunding campaign. Kyiv is inviting people from around the world to take part in achieving victory over the Russian invaders by contributing their money to the drone effort. There are other reasons Ukraine has regained the lead in the drone war. Just because the Russians have come to recognize the importance of drones doesn't mean they're fully competent in drone warfare. The rise of drones that can destroy tanks worth millions of dollars for the price of a few thousand at most has significantly increased the importance of anti-drone defenses. Unfortunately for the Russians, they aren't good at it. Once again, the Ukrainians have proven to be ahead of the curve on this aspect of drone warfare. Just before he was fired from his position as its top general in February, General Valery Zaluzhny said that creating more electronic warfare systems to counter drones was one of the Ukrainian military's most urgent needs. This followed on the heels of a statement from Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, made last October, when he said that every area where soldiers congregate must be protected by anti-drone jammers. Anton Vaklenko, a drone trainer, said that just as both Ukrainian and Russian generals were a year behind on the importance of FPV drones, they were now a year behind on the importance of jammers, though his seniors seem to be getting the message now. Ukraine has recently had assistance in this area. Handheld drone jammers like the Lithuanian Skywiper and more sophisticated systems like the Polish Sky Control have now found their way into the Ukrainian ranks, and these have had enough effectiveness to keep many of Russia's FPV drones grounded. The effectiveness of these jammers was one of the reasons why Russia couldn't gain a decisive advantage in the drone fight, despite outnumbering Ukraine at one point. In contrast, Russia has had far less success with jamming Ukraine's drones. Like Ukraine, Russia has emphasized the production of electronic drone jammers, but in a piece of news that might not surprise you, a lot of them don't work. One notable instance saw a popular Russian military blogger complaining about the common use of a $2,400 jammer. The blogger disassembled this jammer and alleged that it ran too hot to be effective. Its cooling equipment was simply inadequate. Also, the antenna was angled wrong, pointing up when most FPV drones attack from the side, therefore losing 90% of its electronic warfare effectiveness. The antennas cannot be adjusted either, so the troops that are unfortunate enough to use this jammer have no choice but to hope that the Ukrainian drones will somehow come at them from a vertical angle, if the jammer hasn't overheated by then. The military blogger alleged that the popular Two Majors Telegram channel, the same one that promoted the idea that Russia should reclaim Alaska, was causing Russian troops to die by peddling this product to the soldiers through a charitable fund. This would be far from the first time that a social media influencer peddled nonsense. Unfortunately for the Russians, this time the nonsense comes with deadly consequences. To make matters worse for the Russian military, this is far from the only ineffective jammer in their arsenal. An illustration of this occurred in a curious incident in April near Terny, a village west of Kreminna in Luhansk Oblast. There, a Russian attack stalled after it ran into Ukrainian mines and a screen of FPV drones. Russian survivors did what they have often done since the start of the war: abandon their vehicles and run for the hills. One of the vehicles left behind was a brand new and nearly undamaged T-72B3M tank, equipped with a cluster of drone jammers. The Ukrainians nicknamed this new variant of the T-72 Russia's Tsar-EW, electronic warfare tank. This was a significant evolution and, in theory, a much better defense against drones than the infamous cope cages. Ukrainian drone operators understandably got nervous when they saw these tanks appearing on the battlefield. How would these units affect the drone effort? Might they nullify one of their country's best weapons? The only way to find out was to capture one and examine the equipment. Ukraine seized the opportunity at Terny and captured the tank on a mission that lasted 3 nights. The Russian crew was so careless that it not only abandoned the tank intact, but it left it on and drained its batteries. Ukrainian troops had to insert new batteries and then drive the tank back for a mile in the darkness while braving the possibility of Russian artillery fire. When they got back safely, they discovered that the jammers, though equipped with factory-standard antennas, were clustered together in a slapdash fashion and were almost certainly ineffective against FPV drones. The dangerous mission paid off, and at least for now, Ukrainian drone pilots could breathe a sigh of relief. Because of the new production efforts, the effectiveness of Ukraine's jammers, and the ineffectiveness of the Russian jammers, the former has solidified its lead in drone warfare. For the moment, the Russian jammers are likely not the most dangerous thing for Ukraine's drone operators. Enemy drones and artillery are the biggest threats. For these reasons, drone pilots never stay in the same place for long. They move from one cramped bunker or trench to another. It's a game of cat and mouse, with the pilots often looking for their enemies in these hidden places behind the lines that recall World War I. But like in the Great War, these dugouts aren't too far behind the lines. FPV drones don't have the range to provide their pilots the luxury of being out of the range of enemy weapons. Artillery is often pounding the area nearby. If you think being a drone pilot is a safe occupation during wartime, this should be enough to make you think again. They try to sneak some sleep in when they don't have comrades in need of help, but only one pilot at a time can do this. Someone has to keep watch. The pilots are given a set of drones, perhaps 40 for a day's outing, and get to work. This work is vital, which is why breaks are short and often interrupted. Drone support is needed on a moment's notice to assist infantry that comes under attack or to strike important Russian positions. The work can be tedious too. Although Russian jammers are often ineffective on a grand scale, many FPV drones are still lost in combat, and their pilots often have to try again and again to ensure a successful mission. It can take multiple drones to destroy the assigned target. Typically, less than half of FPV drone missions are successful. A top operator like Darwin can achieve success rates of 50%, which is considered good. Experienced pilots mentioned on camera that AI has already helped their drones find moving targets and even people hiding in bunkers, since they can be located from their body heat. AI technology, which permits the drones to take their own initiative to strike targets, is also under development. For the moment, this technology is too expensive to see widespread use, but both sides are competing with each other to develop cheaper versions. Recently, the Ukrainians have developed specialized armor-piercing ammunition, a modification of standard explosive form projectile (EFP) rounds. These rounds are attached to the drones and are particularly effective against armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and self-propelled artillery. Although these EFP rounds are not powerful enough to destroy tanks like other shaped charges are, they have the advantage of a much longer range. The FPV drones can trigger these rounds far from their targets. They will then zigzag through cope cages or protective netting and impact the target. Tellingly, the same Fedorov that mentioned the need for anti-drone defenses sent to Newsweek in December that FPV drones can at times be even more efficient than artillery. Ukraine's shell shortage in late 2023 and early 2024 cost it much on the battlefield. Even now, as Ukraine starts to get more ammunition, Russia is producing shells 3 times faster than Ukraine's allies for a quarter of the cost. Still, Ukraine has managed to stay in the fight and even increase the casualties it's inflicting on Russian troops, in large part thanks to its lead in the FPV drone race. The increased quantity and quality of drones have mitigated some of its disadvantages and given it the opportunity to win the war of attrition, as long as it can maintain the support of its Western allies. What other adaptations do you think might come soon in the drone war? Will the war lead to a world of autonomous machines that can make the decision to kill people on their own, as some analysts expect and fear? What counter-drone technologies might develop next? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also make sure to... In a stunning move that has left Moscow reeling, Sweden has delivered a crippling blow to Russian forces, shifting the tides of the conflict in Ukraine. This unprecedented aid package from Sweden, NATO's newest member, marks a historic departure from its traditional stance of neutrality. What secret strategies and cutting-edge technologies has Sweden unveiled to support Ukraine? How will this affect the balance of power in the region? Let's delve into the dramatic developments that have sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and bolstered Ukraine's fight for freedom. On May 29th, Sweden announced its 16th aid package to Ukraine. Tellingly, this was primarily a military rather than an economic or humanitarian aid package. It is designed to create Russian casualties, which would have been unthinkable for Sweden a few years ago. Such aid is a departure from Sweden's traditional foreign policy. Until Putin decided to invade Ukraine, Stockholm observed a policy of neutrality dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. The last time Sweden entered a conflict was in the Swedish-Norwegian War of 1814. The Swedish public widely supported their country's neutrality, and it was maintained during both world wars. As late as 2012, only 17% of Swedes expressed support for joining NATO. By 2021, the number increased to 46%. But Sweden was always wary of the threat from Russia. The two countries fought the long and bitter Great Northern War in the early 18th century over influence in the Baltic Sea. Sweden lost the conflict and has been on guard against Russia ever since. As early as 1904, Sweden was patrolling the Baltic with submarines to protect its coastline. That mission has given it more underwater experience in the Baltic than any other nation. The Gripen fighter was designed specifically to counter the threat from Russia. Even its radar system is designed to let it look toward Russian territory without flying in its direction. Fear of potential Russian aggression has entered Swedish cultural consciousness. Some of the older locals on Gotland Island, one of the most important locations in the Baltic and the likeliest place in Sweden that Russia would attack, reported in 2015 that they would hear stories from their parents warning that if they failed to finish their dinners, the Russians would get them. Back then, people on the island were divided over whether Swedish military should increase their presence there. No such divisions exist today. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine reawakened historical nightmares among the Swedish public and policymakers in Stockholm. Sweden announced its intention to join NATO a few months later and quickly became a partner to help Ukraine fend off the invasion. Like Germany, Sweden reversed its historical aversion to providing lethal military aid. It began with providing weapons like anti-material weapons, air defenses, and light vehicles. The investments increased, and Sweden demonstrated early on that it was willing to go far in its proportional investment in money and weaponry. On the first anniversary of the war, Sweden said it would donate 10 Leopard 2A5 tanks to Ukraine. Sweden's latest aid package is worth $1.23 billion. To put that into perspective, Sweden's total military spending in 2023 was $8.75 billion. Meanwhile, Sweden's total aid to Ukraine amounts to a little over $4 billion over the course of 16 packages since the invasion started. Such a proportionally large expenditure demonstrates Stockholm's threat perception. Russia's recent successes have required Stockholm to step up its spending even more. The pace of Sweden's separate aid packages also reflects Stockholm's wariness, as several have been passed in the last few months, and they have significantly increased in size. For example, in late February, Sweden announced a $682 million aid package, which was then its largest. The package included 10 CB-90 combat boats, 20 group boats, underwater weapons, $192 million worth of badly needed artillery shells, RBS-70 man-portable air defense systems, anti-tank missiles, Carl Gustaf grenade launchers, hand grenades, and medical supplies. Early in May, Sweden passed aid to help Ukraine secure its energy supply, since this section has been a particular target for Russian missiles and drones. This aid will be spent on equipment like generators, transformers, and solar cells. Will also include necessary spare parts like electrical switches, cables, pumps, and pipes. The May 29th aid package was about twice the size of the February aid package. It does not include donations of the JAS-39 Gripen fighter jet, although Ukraine has expressed interest in this platform in the past and does not rule it out in the future. Kyiv wants to focus on implementing its F-16 program. Stockholm says that it's still working on the possibility of contributing the Gripen system later, but for now it's too much of an ask for Ukraine to divide itself between the two new fighter jet programs. Though it won't be able to donate fighter aircraft, the rest of the aid is substantial. Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Ebba Busch, said that the package consists of equipment that is at the top of Ukraine's priority list. Maybe the most important contribution for the immediate term is in the form of additional 155mm artillery shells. Sweden didn't specify how many shells will be provided, but the new ammunition will help to swell Ukraine's supply to well over 2 million rounds. This will ensure enough ammunition to keep Ukraine in the fight into 2025. The Swedes will also be donating RB-99 AMRAAM missiles, the equivalent of the AIM-120. Sweden's Ministry of Defense says that these missiles will be repurposed specifically to serve in ground-based anti-aircraft systems. Presumably, they'll be supplied for Ukraine's NASAMS units. This is important because Russia took to using its aviation to more effectively support its ground forces after Avdiivka fell, and the proper air support enabled Russian forces to make more rapid advances to the west. Ukraine used its NASAMS and other air defense units to shoot down some of the Russian planes. More ammunition will check Russian aviation and force Moscow to be more cautious with its air power. Sweden will also be sending its entire fleet of PBV-302 infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. These have been retired from Swedish service as the newer Combat Vehicle 90 replaced the PBV-302 in 2014. Stockholm thought it better to donate its older vehicles rather than keep them in storage. Sweden's official announcement of the aid mentioned that the Ukrainian army was organizing several new brigades and needed armored vehicles for their infantry companies, a demand the PBV-302 will help to satisfy. The PBV-302 is armed with a 20mm cannon mounted on a turret to the vehicle's right side. The cannon can be fed with drum magazines, which can each hold 30 rounds. A 7.62mm machine gun can be used as a secondary weapon. It has armor that can withstand 20mm rounds and weighs 12.3 tons. It comes with a crew of 3, the driver, who also serves as a mechanic, the gunner, and the commander. The vehicle can carry up to 8 soldiers in its landing compartment. Over 600 of these vehicles were produced between 1966 and 2014, but that's not the amount Ukraine will receive. Much of the fleet was decommissioned from 2005 onward. By 2018, there were at least 180 still in service in various degrees of readiness. These vehicles are likely the ones Sweden will now hand over to Ukraine. The vehicles are all set to be repaired and modernized to at least some extent before the transfer. The remaining spare parts and maintenance equipment for these vehicles will be donated as part of the package, as will the 20mm shells for the onboard cannons. The PBV-302 will not be the only land vehicles Sweden donates as part of its latest package. The aid also includes surplus fuel transport vehicles in use by the Swedish Armed Forces. Previously donated Swedish material will continue to get upkeep through this aid package. Stockholm intends to help Kyiv with its command and control through donations of terminals with subscriptions for satellite communications. To help with training and military doctrine, the Swedish Defense Research Agency will assist the Ukrainian Armed Forces in creating their own Defense Research Institute. There are also a number of financial support provisions in the package. Most importantly, Sweden will make investments to ensure that Ukraine can get aid on a large scale on a rapid basis. Sweden will permit all of the weapons provided by this package to be used against targets on Russian soil if that's what Ukraine finds proper. Stockholm also claims that it will be able to replenish all of the ammunition and equipment it's sending to Ukraine through new investments. The most notable contribution in the package came in the form of 2 Saab ASCC-890 airborne early warning and control planes. Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson said that these aircraft would have the most significant impact on Ukraine's air defense network. These planes will better allow Ukraine to identify and track incoming missiles and drones. They can also spot targets of opportunity for offensive operations. Training Ukrainian Air Force personnel to fly these planes is also part of the Swedish aid package. Stockholm's decision to donate these aircraft was a significant step beyond the monetary cost. These were the only 2 AWACS aircraft in Sweden's fleet. The Swedes admitted that the donation of these planes and many other provisions in the package meant a temporary vulnerability in their territorial defense. However, they decided to take what Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson called a calculated risk. Perhaps the words of his Danish counterpart, Mette Frederiksen, came to mind. Early in 2024, she pointed out that it was better for European countries to sacrifice their own arsenals temporarily to ensure Russia's defeat far from their own homelands, rather than having to potentially use those weapons against an emboldened Putin far closer to home. Sweden plans to make up for the shortage of command and control planes by purchasing additional S-106 GlobalEye aircraft. This is Saab's newest AWACS aircraft and entered service in 2020. Sweden also insists that it has plans to replenish all of the ammunition and other equipment it will lose once they arrive in Ukraine. Sweden intends to do this by increasing its defense spending. In September 2023, Stockholm announced its intention to increase its military budget by 28% for 2024. Additional increases will come in 2025 and 26. These increases will put Sweden over the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by appropriations. The budget increases will also likely make Sweden an enduring and reliable partner for Ukraine. Stockholm has indeed already announced that its partnership with Ukraine will be for the long haul. On May 23rd, Prime Minister Kristersson said that Sweden will be providing Ukraine with $7 billion in aid over the course of 3 years to repel the invasion. The package released to Ukraine the following week was only the first of multiple packages to come, and those packages will likely get bigger as time goes on. Thanks to the increases in Sweden's military budget over the coming years, the country will be in position to deliver on this planned aid. The Ministry of Defense officially announced major planned investments in artillery systems and transport aircraft as part of the domestic defense spending program. These investments will put Sweden in a position to produce and deliver the weapons and ammunition Ukraine needs in the coming years. But how does Sweden's recent and coming aid impact Ukraine's ability to win the war of attrition? In December 2023, a report by the Estonian Ministry of Defense indicated that Ukraine could win the war in 2025 if it killed or maimed 100,000 Russian troops in 2024. While Russia has the ability to call many more soldiers than that to its colors, these people need to be trained properly and then assigned to a cohesive unit if they are to be effective on the battlefield. These units would quickly suffer casualties, creating even more demand for manpower that would in turn send troops to the front with even less training. It will be a vicious cycle that Russia, even with its much greater amount of available manpower than Ukraine, would not be capable of meeting. The Estonians estimated that if Ukraine met the 100,000 benchmark, it could reduce Russian training capacity to 80,000 properly trained troops per year. The rest would be ineffective cannon fodder. Sweden's donation, especially with the new artillery shells, will help Ukraine to achieve this objective. Since Ukraine killed or maimed an average of 172,000 Russian troops in each of the first 2 years of the war, this seems like it will be achievable, particularly with help from countries like Sweden. Sweden has emerged from over 200 years of military neutrality with surprising speed, and while there may be doubts about the feasibility of continuing to aid Ukraine in the United States, in Sweden there are none. Sweden doesn't have the luxury of an ocean to separate it from its old enemy. For Stockholm, it's better to defeat Russia on foreign soil than potentially need to defeat it on soil or in waters close to home. Even proportionally large investments and temporary depletion of domestic arsenals have not dissuaded Sweden's leaders from this opinion. Putin may hope that many of the countries that now oppose him will become exhausted with Ukraine over time and lose interest in continuing the effort. For deep historical reasons, Sweden is unlikely to be one of those countries, and that's important because it might be proportionally small, but it has a strong defense industry. It will also look bad if Sweden, the newest member of NATO and also one of its smaller participants, were to continue supporting Ukraine at significant cost to itself while the others did nothing. What impact will Sweden's aid have on the war dynamics? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: Ukraine is not alone in its fight for freedom. What do you think of the support Sweden has lent to Ukraine throughout the war, and how will it affect Kyiv's ability to win the war of attrition? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. That's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and it's setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Mans' claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine, though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids. The incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. To rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, the Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry. What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war, even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo Zhirokov points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk, and also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the 5 it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop, and worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video. What comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only cost it hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. It's January 2024, and General Patrick Sanders stands before an audience at the International Armored Vehicles Exhibition in London. However, the general doesn't merely have vehicles on his mind. A much bigger problem troubles him: Russia. During his speech, Sanders stresses that the UK needs to achieve a mental shift, particularly when it comes to the British public and its collective preparedness for war. Conscription still isn't on the table, the general says, but the country's army as it stands right now isn't strong enough. He tells the audience that the UK needs to modernize and may even have to build a citizen army that's ready for a land war. He then delivers a chilling warning. Within the next 3 years, it must be credible to talk of a British army of 120,000 folding in our reserve and strategic force, but this is not enough. Why will it not be enough? Again, Russia. Sanders' speech rattles a few cages at 10 Downing Street. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak dismisses Sanders' words, saying that presenting hypothetical scenarios isn't helpful to anybody. That especially goes for the general's comments that the Ukraine war has shown that it's not regular armies that win wars, it's citizen armies. The UK should follow in Ukraine's footsteps, he argues, or at the very least, be mentally prepared to do so. His message is clear. The UK has no choice but to prepare for war with Russia. And his statements lead to some questions. Why does the UK have to prepare, and just how credible are Sanders' claims? Assuming the general is correct, how would the UK fare if it faced Russia today? And what, if anything, is it doing to prepare for a war with one of the world's largest militaries? To begin answering those questions, we must first dive into the relationship between the UK and Russia. Both nations have essentially been at peace since the end of the Crimean War and have been allies fighting alongside each other in 2 world wars. Given that somewhat friendly history, how have relations between the two countries fractured to the point where the UK needs to be ready for war? It all starts with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise to the Russian presidency in 2000 marked the end of the cooperative relationship the UK enjoyed with Russia following the end of the Cold War. That end didn't come immediately. Rather, a series of events slowly transformed the relationship from one of cooperation into one of confrontation, perhaps starting with an infamous incident, the 2006 murder of Alexander Litvinenko. A former officer with the Federal Security Service, or FSB, Russia's replacement for the KGB, Litvinenko was a Russian spy who had become critical of his country. In 1999, Litvinenko earned the FSB's ire when he claimed that the agency had begun colluding with the Russian mafia and was responsible for several apartment bombings in Russian cities that Russia then used to justify the Chechen War. But perhaps more dangerous to Litvinenko, according to a 2016 report by The Guardian, was that he had a personal vendetta against Putin. When Putin became the director of FSB in 1998, 2 years before he ascended to the presidency, Litvinenko met with him to argue against the corruption he saw in the agency. Putin listened to him make his case and did nothing, creating bad blood between the two. It's likely this incident that prompted Litvinenko to leave FSB and flee to Britain in 2000, where it's believed he started working for the MI6 spy agency and developed associations with former Chechen leader Ahmed Zakayev and a Russian oligarch named Boris Berezovsky, both critics of the Kremlin, both enemies of Vladimir Putin. If those associations weren't bad enough, Litvinenko was also not shy about attacking Russia's president. In July 2006, he wrote an explosive article in which he claimed Putin was a pedophile who had abused his position as the head of FSB in the late 1990s to destroy videotape evidence of himself having sex with underage boys. Add to that further accusations that Putin was responsible for the October 2006 murder of a Russian journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, and Litvinenko had placed himself on Putin's hit list. It wouldn't be long before Putin enacted his revenge. In November 2006, Litvinenko was killed inside the UK through the use of a poison named polonium-210, which had been administered to a cup of tea. The inquest that followed revealed that Litvinenko was being paid by MI6, though the specific terms of his employment weren't revealed, and that he had been targeted by assassins. Specifically, the two men he met for that fateful cup of tea, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, were accused of being the men who administered the poison. However, they weren't acting alone. The inquest revealed that Putin likely greenlit the order to kill Litvinenko. The assassination triggered a turning point in UK and Russian relations, with the UK being incensed over the fact that Russia would kill somebody on British soil. In addition, Russia had been uncooperative with the investigation and even refused to extradite one of the suspects. Several Russian diplomats were expelled from the country in response to the killing, along with the UK ending its intelligence cooperation with Russia and freezing some of its assets. If nothing else, the incident showed the UK that Putin was willing to violate the country's laws to get what he wanted. Litvinenko's assassination wouldn't be the last time this happened. In March 2018, a Russian double agent named Sergei Skripal was poisoned in the UK. A former officer with Russia's GRU agency, a military intelligence unit, Skripal and his daughter were found slumped on a park bench 8 years after arriving in the UK as part of a spy swap deal in 2010. Both survived. Two Russian men, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Borisov, were accused of the crime, and details soon emerged that demonstrated the covert nature of their attempted assassination. Skripal was poisoned using a Russian-made military-grade nerve agent, with the poison having been applied through the squirt of a perfume bottle. Russia denied all involvement. It claimed that rogue elements had somehow gained access to the nerve agent and had used it without the Kremlin's knowledge. Britain's then Prime Minister Theresa May gave Putin 24 hours to prove his claims, which he failed to do so in the eyes of the British government. By March 2018, the UK was saying that there was no alternative conclusion other than the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Another attack on citizens inside the UK, and yet another incident that further soured the relationship between Britain and Russia. The Guardian claimed in 2018 that the incident plunged the relationship between the countries to its lowest depths since the 1980s and the cruise missile crisis. But those relations would reach new depths in February 2022. On February 17, 2022, the UK created new legislation that would give its ministers the power to impose fresh sanctions on Russia's businesses and oligarchs. The decision came in the wake of growing tensions in Europe as Putin appeared to be gearing up to invade Ukraine. About a week later, Russian soldiers started a war that continues to rage to this day. The UK joined the rest of the Western international community in condemning the war and used its new powers to levy sanctions. It also began supplying aid to Ukraine, along with many other countries, with Britain's contributions having reached $54.2 billion in value as of July 2024. All of this backstory matters because it paints a picture of the two countries that have experienced continued fracturing of their relationship over the last 24 years. Through his assassination attempts, Putin has shown that he not only lacks respect for the UK and its laws, but that he's willing to deploy agents into the country to get what he wants. He has set a precedent. Russia has operated in Britain before, and it may well do so again. Only this time those operations would escalate into full-scale war. Assassinations, secret plots, and sanctions combined do not create an atmosphere in which that war would occur. It's what's happened since Russia invaded Ukraine that has led the UK to the point where it needs to prepare. Take the repeated threats from Russia as an example. In February 2024, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev commented on the concept of Russia returning to the borders it had in 1991. Doing so would be untenable, claimed Medvedev, who now serves as Russia's Security Council head, as it would mean Russia would have to give up the territory it's taken in Ukraine, as well as Crimea and Chechnya. Speaking on Telegram, a social media platform that's popular in Russia, Medvedev issued a chilling threat. Attempts to return Russia to the borders of 1991 will lead to only one thing: towards a global war with Western countries using the entire strategic arsenal of our state. Medvedev then claimed that any attempt to return to those borders would represent the West forcing a direct and irreversible collapse of Russia, before he built on his strategic arsenal comments. Threats were levied against Kyiv, Washington, Berlin, and London, with Medvedev claiming all four have long been included in the flight targets of our nuclear triad. Better to return everything to how Russia wants it, demanded Medvedev, or Russia will return it themselves, with maximum losses for the enemy. The context here is simple. Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike Britain if the UK takes part in any concerted effort to force Russia to return to its old borders. Suddenly, General Sanders' comments about the need to be prepared are cast in a new light. Perhaps they're not a case of scaremongering, but instead the statements of a man who has seen enough to know that Russia is a clear threat. Sanders sees the deterioration of the relationship between Russia and Britain, with Medvedev's nuclear threats only confirming that he's likely right to be worried. Speaking of those nuclear threats, just what would Britain face if Russia pushed the nuclear button? In 2023, the Arms Control Association, or ACA, estimated that Russia has a stockpile of 5,580 nuclear weapons. About 1,200 of these have been retired, meaning they're no longer in active stockpile and are awaiting dismantling. Of course, given that they aren't dismantled yet, those nukes could still be used if Russia felt the need. However, more worrying for Britain are the 1,549 strategically deployed nuclear warheads. These are warheads that are currently installed on ballistic missiles and ready to launch at a moment's notice. It's unknown how many of that 1,549 are directed at Britain. However, we do know that Russia easily has enough nuclear weapons to level the United Kingdom. In October 2022, the UK-based Sky News ran a report in which it examined the threat that Russia's nuclear weapons pose. General Sir Richard Barrons, a British defense expert, is quoted when commenting on Putin's decision to place his nuclear deterrent forces on high alert in March 2022. Speaking about Russia's weapons, he claimed, "The warhead at the front of it has a yield between 300 and 800 kilotons. It would take just one of these nuclear weapons to destroy London," Barrons says. The UK isn't helpless on the nuclear front. The ACA highlights that it has 224 nukes of its own, plus it's allied with France and the United States, which are both NATO members and nuclear states that would come to Britain's defense if it was attacked on its own soil. But by that point, it would be too late for Britain. Russia has more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of the UK's major cities. Of course, these are far from the only nuclear threats that Russia has thrown around. It has a long history of using the threat of nukes to try and get its way, dating back to the Cold War era. Yet another nuclear threat, albeit one made in response to the possibility of Russia losing its current borders, may not be enough to convince Britain that it needs to prepare for war. But Medvedev's is far from the only threat made by Russia to the UK. During a state visit to Ukraine in May 2024, former British Foreign Secretary David Cameron committed to delivering at least $3 billion in military aid annually to Ukraine for as long as is required. However, that wasn't the headline from the visit. Instead, it was a single quote that made waves. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself. The quote was taken as Cameron's indirect way of permitting Ukraine to do something it had previously been unable to do, use British-provided weapons to attack Russia on its own soil. While Cameron's comments provided room for doubt, further comments made by new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer removed that doubt entirely. Speaking to Bloomberg journalists on July 9, 2024, Starmer claimed that it was up to Ukraine to decide how it would use British weapons, including the long-range Storm Shadow missiles the UK has been sending. Those missiles can travel for 155 miles, far enough for Ukraine to launch them from within its own territory to strike at Russia behind the front lines of the war. Russia was incensed. In the wake of Cameron's comments, Moscow summoned Britain's ambassador to Russia to the Foreign Ministry to deliver a message. Any strikes made by Ukraine on Russian territory using weapons supplied by the UK would force retaliatory strikes on British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere. The implication is that elsewhere could mean on British soil. Yet another threat, and yet another justification for General Sanders' comments that Britain needs to prepare. The UK didn't backpedal on Cameron's statements in the wake of Russia's threats, with Starmer's July 2024 comments only adding fuel to the fire. Russia argues that Britain is needlessly escalating tensions. The UK's refusal to back down means that the threat of war between the two countries is higher than ever. However, it's not just direct threats against Britain that could lead to the UK and Russia going to war. It's Putin's threats against British allies. In January 2024, the British government released a risk analysis that claimed there is a 1 in 4 chance that Russia will launch an attack on a British ally within the next 2 years. That analysis came just days after General Sanders' warnings and the government's shooting down of those warnings, with the report describing Russia as an adversary state throughout. The report claimed that there was a 25% chance of Russia attacking a non-NATO ally, such as Sweden. Of course, Sweden has since become a member of NATO, potentially reducing the possibility of such an attack. But if it were to occur, Britain would find itself going to war not because it was attacked directly, but because it was bound to do so by Article 5 of the NATO Convention. The article essentially states that an attack on one NATO member's soil is treated as an attack on all members, with those who aren't being attacked duty-bound to come to the defense of the country that's being targeted. The message here is simple. Russian aggression toward countries like Sweden, Finland, or the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia could mean war between Britain and Russia. NATO hasn't lowered these tensions. If anything, it's exacerbated them with the creation of Operation Steadfast Defender 2024. Touted by NATO as the organization's largest military exercise since the Cold War, the joint effort saw 90,000 troops from all of NATO's 32 members converge on Europe to conduct a host of military exercises between January and May 2024. The exercises were split into two parts. First, the United troops would carry out a series of exercises focused on securing the Atlantic Ocean through to the Arctic Ocean. From there, ground-based troops would move across Europe, traveling from the north of the continent through its center and finally into Eastern Europe. NATO's stated goal was simple: demonstrate the organization's ability to defend every inch of its territory. But if it's to win against Russia, it likely needs to do more. That may mean an even greater commitment to spending, as well as increasing cooperation with its allies to ensure that collective defense is really what it's touted to be if Russia's aggression extends to Britain's shores. But what do you think? Does the UK really need to prepare for a war with Russia, or is General Sanders focusing on a future that's unlikely to happen? What else should Britain do to bolster its military? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. Now go and check out "The UK just gave Putin a devastating blow," or click this other video instead. It's August 6th, 2024. The date marks the first time that Ukraine's pilots have started flying F-16s, an event that many see as a potential turning point for the Ukraine war. Granted, the limited number of F-16s provided to Ukraine by its Western allies won't allow it to establish full aerial superiority over Russia. But now it has options. Localized superiority is possible, as are aerial attacks on Russian encampments and even Russian territory. It's a big moment for Ukraine. But soon the arrival of F-16s is going to be overshadowed by Ukraine making a move that nobody expected. Ukraine is about to invade Russia. Specifically, its forces are going to break the front lines to the north of the country and pour into Kursk, a Russian oblast that is sparsely populated and even more sparsely defended. Russia hasn't placed much importance on the region, instead preferring to focus most of its invasion efforts in Donetsk as it continues a slow push toward Kyiv. But the night of August 6, 2024 changes everything. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. In this video, we're going to explain why Ukraine's invasion of Russia has changed the entire complexion of the war, to the point that Putin may never fully recover, and explain why it's such a crucial event. But before we do, we'll start with a quick recap. On August 7th, reports started circulating that Russia had supposedly repelled a group of 300 Ukrainian fighters, supported by tanks, that broke through the front lines in the north of Ukraine and entered Kursk. Russian officials claimed the Ukrainian offensive resulted in 5 deaths and 20 injuries, but the implication was that it had been successfully fought off. The implication was wrong. As more details emerged about Ukraine's unexpected foray into Russian territory, it was quickly revealed that this was no small attack. For Russia, the situation was far from controllable, despite the words of Kursk regional head Alexei Smirnov. Instead, Ukraine hadn't just gotten into Russian territory, it was advancing at a rapid pace. Intense fighting marked August 8th, with more details rapidly emerging. The French news outlet Le Monde revealed that Ukraine's incursion involved as many as 1,000 soldiers, with a further 2,000 backing that initial group up from behind the Ukrainian border, and that the invasion was of a far larger scale than Russia claimed. It has also been remarkably successful. Ukraine had pushed 9 miles into Kursk, taking 20 villages along the way. Among those villages was the small town of Sudza, which is home to a gas transmission station that Russia used to send natural gas to the rest of Europe. Far from controlling the situation, as Smirnov claimed he would, the Kursk regional leader instead declared a state of emergency. Thousands of Russians have been evacuated from their homes so far, indicating that Russia has failed to prevent the Ukrainian advance, despite all of its claims to the contrary. The advance has continued to August 13th, the date of the scripting of this video. Between August 8th and now, Ukraine has launched multiple drone and artillery strikes against locations in Kursk. It's also advanced even further into Russian territory. August 9th saw the Institute for the Study of War claim that Ukraine had pushed on from the initial 9 miles it had captured, with its soldiers advancing as far as Kromskaya Baiki, which is over 21 miles into Russian territory. That day also saw Ukraine officially confirm the invasion, with the country having remained tight-lipped during the initial 3 days of fighting. More attacks followed in the coming days. Russia claimed that the UK was helping Ukraine with its invasion, with State Duma member Adalby Shagashev saying that English had been heard among the soldiers. That isn't confirmed, and it's just an indicator of just how much chaos Ukraine's forces are spreading throughout Kursk. The strategy was also unfurling. Ukraine was sending small groups of soldiers into villages, bypassing Russian fortifications in the process, before fighting and withdrawing to attack elsewhere. Those small groups were being followed by larger ones, which consolidated and kept the territory the smaller groups attacked, as Russia's forces found themselves further spread out and confused. This was no quick raid. Ukraine was actively capturing and keeping territory in Russia. Russia responded by sending more forces to the Kursk region, diverting soldiers who had previously been on the front lines in Donetsk in an effort to tackle the emerging problem. Those diversions haven't stopped Ukraine. Over the last few days, it's expanded its incursions to include the Belgorod region, another Russian oblast close to the Ukraine border, which is now seeing small groups of Ukrainian troops launching attacks and taking territory. Today, there may be as many as 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers occupying territory inside Russia. Over 76,000 civilians have been evacuated, with many en route to Moscow, and Ukraine is claiming that it continues to take territory. On August 12th, Commander Alexander Syrsky, who is one of Ukraine's leading military minds, claimed that Ukraine controlled 28 villages and a staggering 386 square miles of Russian territory. Ukraine had taken a massive gamble with this invasion. Faced both with encroaching Russian forces in Donetsk and the possibility of international blowback over it finally taking the role of aggressor in its fight against Russia, it rolled the dice. It gambled that it would not only be able to get away with fighting in Kursk, but that it would also successfully capture Russian territory without Putin resorting to nuclear weapons. It also gambled its relationship with its Western partners. Crossing the final red line had the potential to anger some of the countries that have provided weapons and financial support to Ukraine. The gamble paid off. Ukraine officially holds Russian territory. And even more worrying for Putin, he's had to watch as his forces have crumbled, and the responses that he's attempted to muster have not only failed to dispel Ukraine's forces, those responses have also failed to stop Ukraine from pushing even further. The Kursk invasion has changed everything. Putin has suffered the biggest humiliation he's ever experienced as Russian leader, and it's a humiliation from which he may never recover. Why? It all starts with exposure. Ukraine's actions in Kursk have exposed Russia's military as being far weaker than anybody anticipated. Of course, you could argue that the entire war has been a cavalcade of this type of exposure for Russia. When Putin first launched his special military operation in February 2022, much of the world assumed that it would be over quickly. After all, Russia had a far larger, and on paper, much stronger military. Even today, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel compared to Ukraine's 900,000. With rounds of conscription leading to more being called up as needed, Russia has more than 10 times the number of aircraft, as well as 13,000 more tanks and more than 139,000 more armored vehicles. It should have steamrolled through Ukraine, even with the military support Ukraine is receiving from Western nations. Instead, we've seen a protracted war in which Russia has failed to establish any sort of aerial dominance. As the Journal of the JAPCC points out, Russia quickly started losing not only its outdated Su-25s, but also its far more modern Su-30s, Su-34s, and Su-35s when fighting Ukraine. The losses were so bad that Russia resorted to launching aerial attacks from behind the front lines. It uses glide bombs, old Soviet-era bombs fitted with a modern wing mechanism, to assault Ukrainian fortifications rather than risking its helicopters and fighters. That shouldn't have happened. With its aerial might, Russia should have been able to support its troops on the ground with precision strikes from its fighter jets, but it's failed to do so. Russia has also lost about a third of the Black Sea Fleet to Ukrainian missile and drone strikes, meaning the small naval component of the war that should have been in Russia's favor has become largely irrelevant. On the ground, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that Russia has lost around 594,400 soldiers, along with nearly 8,500 tanks, over 16,000 armored fighting vehicles, and around 16,800 artillery units. Then there's the increasing reliance on Soviet-era equipment. Reports suggest that Russia has resorted to using old T-55 tanks, which are 65 years old and far from capable of serving in direct assaults against Ukrainian positions due to their thin steel armor being easily penetrable by even basic rocket launch grenades. That's without mentioning the more modern drones and weapons Ukraine has been using to take out Russian tanks. In short, the entire war has offered humiliation after humiliation for Putin, with his increasingly aging stocks of equipment failing to achieve the victory the world assumed would have happened long before now. Fast forward to today, and the Kursk invasion further exposes Russia's weakness. It shows that Russia has failed to properly fortify the entire front line, which stretches around 620 miles. To the north, in particular, Russia didn't dedicate enough manpower or equipment to guarding the front line, allowing a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers to break through and enter Kursk. It was too focused on Donetsk and too complacent elsewhere. Now it faces attacks on its own territory that would have been unimaginable when the war began. It gets worse for Putin. Not only does Russia face attacks in its own territory, but it's failing to fend them off. Ukraine is advancing through Kursk, as well as encroaching into Belgorod. Russia is actively losing villages and townships, showing that its faltering attacking might is matched by a lack of proper defenses behind the front lines. From there, add the lack of Western response to these attacks. None of Ukraine's allies have come out to oppose the strikes, with the biggest response being a request from the White House for Ukraine to provide details about its objectives for the Kursk region. That's more bad news for Putin. It shows that the West believes he's too weak to do anything about Ukraine invading Russian territory. Now, Putin's threats, which he has repeatedly failed to follow up on, seem even weaker than they did before, as the Russian leader instead faces the humiliation of allowing a war he started to come to his doorstep. All of this brings us to the second reason why the Kursk invasion represents a pivotal moment for Putin as Russia's leader. It represents the crossing of the final red line in the Ukraine war. These red lines are the actions that have been taken throughout the war that the West believed would provoke Putin into further action. Providing military aid to Ukraine was considered a red line at the war's beginning, leading to several countries choosing to only offer non-lethal equipment. That red line has since been thoroughly crossed. Ukraine has now received over $121 billion in aid from Europe, along with about $82 billion from the US, with more incoming. Other supposed red lines included the installation of NATO infrastructure in Finland and Sweden, which is now extremely likely given that both have become NATO members since the war in Ukraine began, and Western countries allowed Ukraine to use the weapons they provide in Russian territory. All of those lines have been crossed. Putin has done nothing about them. With Ukraine's advancement into Kursk, the final red line in the Ukraine war has disappeared, and Putin quickly revealed that he will once again do nothing in response. At least he'll do nothing to the West. For all of his bluster about what such an incursion could mean in the context of a global war, Putin has barely been able to summon defenses against a few thousand Ukrainians within his border. Ukraine continues to advance as Putin looks weaker than ever. The invasion is a humiliation. It's something that not only should have never happened from a militaristic point of view, as Russia was supposed to be so strong that Ukraine would never break through the front lines, but it's also an invasion that represents humiliation for Putin geopolitically. His lack of follow-through on his threats throughout the war has shown the West that Russia's leader likely believes that his military isn't capable of taking on the rest of Europe. And psychologically, as the Atlantic Council points out, this crossing of the final red line also strikes a powerful blow against enemy morale. Russia, having already seen its military fail to defeat Ukraine quickly, now has to contend with mass evacuations and the panic that comes with having an invading force in its own territory. Putin's failures have forced his people to experience a taste of the medicine he's trying to deliver to Ukraine. The result is a growing lack of appetite for the Ukraine war in Russia itself. This was revealed by Euronews in December 2023, when it reported on a poll conducted by the independent company Chronicle. That poll discovered that support for the Ukraine war in Russia had nearly halved since a similar poll conducted in February 2023. Speaking to 1,199 adults across Russia between October 17th and 22nd, the Chronicle found that those who expressed consistent support for the war dropped to 12% from the previous result of 22%. What's more, 40% of those surveyed supported Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, even if Russia's war objectives weren't achieved. The poll also revealed that 33% of Russians were against exiting Ukraine now that Russia is there, but even that number fell substantially from the 47% seen in February 2023. These dismal numbers, from Putin's perspective, were recorded before Ukraine invaded Kursk. With the final red line disappearing into the distance, it's only logical to assume that even more Russians will now want the war to end because they're scared that their homes could be next on the Ukrainian agenda. And as if to add all of these problems for Putin, America's response to Ukraine's actions has been flippant at best. Beyond the previously mentioned inquiries from the White House, August 13th saw President Joe Biden tell reporters in New Orleans that the invasion is creating a real dilemma for Putin. While the US has been quick to deny any involvement in the operation, "We had nothing to do with this," said White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre. This is far from the response Putin would have wanted. The US should have been on Ukraine's back from the moment it crossed into Russian territory. It was meant to warn Ukraine that this was an escalation that couldn't be tolerated, while telling them they needed to get out and only fight to defend Ukrainian territory. None of that happened. So Putin is left with a situation where the West isn't trying to stop Ukraine from invading, which tells him and the Russian people that the West isn't afraid of Russia anymore. The tentative approach taken at the beginning of the Ukraine war has evaporated. The red lines are all crossed. Putin has done very little in response other than continue his special military operation, and the Russian president's humiliation runs deeper. He's even had to deal with his own people losing their appetite for the war, even long before it arrived in their country. Russian morale is low. Putin's position as a strongman in Russian politics is now on shaky ground. And even worse for Russia's leader is that there are even more issues that the Kursk invasion has caused. Issues like Ukraine forcing Russia to change its strategy. As the National Interest pointed out in an article on August 10th covering Ukraine's high-stakes gamble, the incursion into Kursk may have been as much a strategic play as it was a move designed to expose Russia's weaknesses. On August 1st, Al Jazeera reported that the last week of July 2024 saw Russia launch the largest assault in 8 months within the Donetsk region of Ukraine. That assault was successful, as it led to Russia claiming several Ukrainian settlements and brought Russia closer to cutting off key supply lines that are helping Ukraine's troops fight against it in Donetsk. With those supply routes cut off, Ukraine would be forced to withdraw from the region en masse. Donetsk has been a key Russian focus for much of 2023 and into 2024. Earlier in the year, it managed to take Avdiivka, which many saw as a key Ukrainian fortification. That followed the taking of Bakhmut in May 2023, a similar fortified location that was key to Ukraine's defenses. Through these advances, it's clear that Russia is attempting to slowly take territory in Ukraine's east and south. By taking these fortified towns, Russia can press its advantage because it now has multiple launching points for offensives in southeastern Ukraine. August 4th brought with it more bad news for Ukraine in Donetsk. The country was forced to order the mandatory evacuation of children, along with their guardians, from Donetsk's eastern region in the face of Russian advances. More villages were falling, and more locations were being bombed. Ukraine has been standing on the edge of losing one of its territories for months now. Russia has even claimed that it successfully annexed Donetsk back in 2022, even though it still doesn't have full control of the territory. Why does any of this matter in the context of the Kursk invasion? Russia's advancement through Donetsk had forced Ukraine into a position where it couldn't make any significant breakthroughs in the south or east. Russia's forces are simply too strong in those regions, with Russia also sending a seemingly never-ending supply of manpower to the region to fortify the positions it takes. Enter the Kursk invasion. By committing so many people to Donetsk, Putin failed to properly supply the troops occupying the northern front lines. That paved the way for Ukraine's forces to break through and into Russia. Now that Ukraine is in Kursk and taking territory itself, Russia will be forced to divert forces away from Donetsk to defend itself. Forces and equipment will have to go north to fight back against the invading forces in Kursk, with much of those resources coming from Donetsk. Thus, Ukraine gains new opportunities. At the time of the writing of this script, we're entering the 9th day of the Kursk invasion. Ukraine isn't being pushed back. If anything, it's gaining more territory, showcasing how poor Russia's defenses are. And the best Putin can muster is a promise to provide a 10,000 ruble handout to those who are affected. That amounts to $109, a pittance for people who are now facing losing their homes. A strong man has been brought to his knees by the Kursk invasion. Only time will tell if he is able to get back up, or if Ukraine's invasion of Kursk truly stands as a pivotal moment in Putin's presidency. With that, we turn the questions over to you. What do you think the situation in Kursk means for the Ukraine war and Putin's future? Will Ukraine launch further invasions on the back of this success, and is it possible that Putin will be forced to the negotiating table in the wake of these events? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. At the 2024 Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All 3, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty. And that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these 3 countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all 3 nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kharkiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20th, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic common defense zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well, to 61,000 by 2032, and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991, saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II. And again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed. with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand? Or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying the Baltic states, or click this other video instead.